Alright, so this starts part 4 of our PowerPoint over lab materials and equipment. And one of the things that you need to make sure that you know how to do is be able to identify the materials that you see and also understand what they're used for. Now, there are a lot of items that have multiple use, but for the most part what I'll be going through is the main use. I might mention some other uses, but I'll be mentioning mostly the main use of each one of these things. Alright, so let's head on through here. Well, a beaker obviously is a common piece of lab equipment. There's glass, comes in multiple sizes. You know, there's 150 milliliter, there's 500 milliliter. There are all kinds of beakers. And for the most part, beakers are used for heating. Now, you can also store things in them, but there are better containers that hold chemicals other than beakers. But beakers can be used for that. But for the most part, beakers are used for heating. When we talk about the heating apparatus later on in another part, we'll show how you can heat up a beaker. But I mean, beaker you can place directly onto a hot plate, or you can use a Bunsen burner to heat the liquid. So a beaker is used for heating, and that's the main thing you need to know how to recognize it as well. Graduated cylinder. Use these items, graduated cylinders, to measure volume. You never, ever heat graduated cylinders. The glass is not made to be heated. The only thing you use graduated cylinders for is to measure volumes. And of course, you should know that volume is the amount of space something takes up, but it's usually in milliliters. These also come in different sizes. You can have very tiny 10 milliliter graduated cylinders, or you can have 1,000 milliliter graduated cylinders, but they all have the same basic shape, just a different size. But don't ever heat a graduated cylinder. So they are used to measure approximate volumes. That's what you need to know. Well, there are other items to measure volumes that we'll get to later, but graduated cylinder is the most common for measuring volume. Erlenmeyer flask, another glass piece of equipment, can be used for heating. So it can be used just like a beaker for heating. Of course, it has a different shape, as you can see. There's no lip on it. It has a narrower top. But it is really used in what's called acid-base titrations. Now, we haven't talked about what titrations mean, but you just need to learn to associate the word Erlenmeyer flask with the word titrations. That's it's pretty common to use this type of equipment in a titration. And it says may be heated, so you can also use them for heating. But if you had a choice between using a beaker or using a flask, and you're heating something, you're going to choose the beaker over the flask. Another type of flask is a Florence flask. And a Florence flask is also something that can be used in heating, but it traditionally, just because of the shape of it, is used when you want to do a slow heating. So you're not going to titrate with a Florence flask. You're going to use it to heat something, but typically it's going to be something that you want to heat slowly. So Florence flask and Erlenmeyer flask, make sure you understand the difference between the two, because it's very easy to get confused. And I know that on a quiz that I give over identifying equipment, the Florence flask and the Erlenmeyer flask are typically mixed up. So Florence flask has the rounded shape. It almost looks like a vase. So I usually tell my students to think of the term flower, where typically you'll put those in vases sometimes, and the word Florence. They both start with FLO. That's a good way to remember that a Florence flask kind of looks like a vase. The Erlenmeyer flask does not. Oh, and we also use the Florence flask in distillation experiments. If you don't know what distillation is simply where you take different liquids and you separate the liquids by their boiling points. So if you have alcohol and water, for example, mixed, you're going to see that the alcohol will boil first because it has a lower boiling point. The water is a little bit higher. So distillation is the separation of liquids by their boiling points. And Florence flasks are typically used for that type of experiment. All right, test tubes, a pretty common, let's go back. A pretty common item in lab. Also a very common piece of equipment that gets broken because test tubes tend to fall on the floor while they're being held in test tube clamps. We'll get to the clamps later. But test tubes are really only one used for heating. I've seen them used for storage as well and for experimenting, that sort of thing. But for the most part, test tubes are just used for heating. But obviously you can't heat that much because test tubes only get so big. So test tubes, heating, a lot of equipment that we talked about used with heating, but test tubes really, that's their only use. All right, so this ends part 4 of the lab materials and lab safety PowerPoint, and part 5 will be coming soon.